Welcome to a deep dive into Canadian family law.
It's a fascinating area.
It is, isn't it? Um, you're looking to understand a bit more about how Canadian courts are handling things like relocation, spousal support, the division of property.
Yeah, and we've got three cases here from 2024, all dealing with this idea of coercive control, which is becoming a really big deal in family law.
Okay, so before we jump into the cases themselves, can we take a step back?
Sure.
For anyone who's not a lawyer, could you explain what coercive control actually means?
Absolutely. So it's not always as obvious as physical abuse.
Right.
Right. It's a lot more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about a pattern of behaviors that one person uses to dominate and control their partner.
Okay.
So, this can look like isolating them from their friends and family,
I see.
controlling their finances, constantly putting them down,
Oh, wow.
undermining their self-esteem. It's really about power creating an imbalance in the relationship where one person feels trapped and afraid to even speak up.
Wow. That's a really good explanation. Thanks for that. So how are these cases that we're going to look at today? How do they actually show coercive control playing out in these real-life legal battles?
Well, each case, I think, tackles it from a different angle. The first one we have is Shipton v. Shipton,
Okay.
which went all the way up to the Ontario Court of Appeal.
Oh, wow.
And this case is about a mother who wants to relocate to Ireland
With her daughter.
with her 3-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
The father is fighting to stop her.
And I think wasn't part of her reasoning for wanting to relocate that she had been a victim of coercive control throughout the relationship.
Exactly. That's exactly right. She presented evidence from a bunch of different sources. She had a friend of hers testify. She had midwives who had actually observed the couple.
Oh, wow.
And she even had affidavits from family members.
Oh.
All of this was to paint this picture of the father,
Oh, wow.
controlling her finances,
Yeah.
telling her who she could and couldn't see. And there were even times where he physically restrained her. And I think for our listeners, it's important to remember that an affidavit is a written statement given under oath.
Oh, right.
So it's taken very seriously by the courts.
So this isn't just, like a simple disagreement about, like a better school district or something like that.
No.
There's some really serious stuff going on here.
There's a lot more to it.
So how did the court
Well,
handle this? Like, did they take these claims of coercive control seriously?
so initially, the trial judge actually didn't find enough evidence of coercive control to impact his decision about the relocation.
Oh, wow.
But get this, the appeal court actually completely overturned that ruling
Oh, wow.
because they said that the trial judge had ignored a lot of very important evidence,
Interesting.
especially testimony from independent sources like those midwives.
Wow. So what does that mean for other cases where coercive control is being alleged? It sounds like the appeal court is really setting a precedent here.
It is. It definitely is. They went out of their way to emphasize just how damaging coercive control can be, especially for kids growing up in that environment.
Right.
And they basically said, look, courts can't just brush these claims aside anymore.
Yeah.
They can't minimize how big of an impact this has.
Wow. And so that really kind of brings in that whole concept of best interests of the child.
Yeah.
Which kind of is like the guiding principle in these kinds of cases.
Right.
So they're saying that coercive control really impacts the best interests of the child.
Absolutely. And what I think is really interesting is how they actually expanded the definition of best interests in this case.
Okay.
So, before it was very much about physical safety.
Like being fun.
Are their basic needs being met? But they're saying emotional well-being and stability are just as important as those things.
Mm.
And they specifically rejected the idea that a 3-year-old is, just a blank slate that
Wow.
can easily adapt to any new situation.
Yeah, you can just kind of pluck them out of their environment and drop them in a new place and it'll be fine.
No, they disagreed with that completely.
So they're saying no uprooting a child can have a really significant impact.
Yes,
Especially when there's that history of coercive control.
exactly. And it's a much more nuanced view.
Yeah.
And it's very child-centered, which is a big win, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got this really kind of landmark decision in Shipton v. Shipton that really kind of sets the stage for how we view coercive control in Canadian family law. So what about the second case, AJ v. MN?
Okay.
That one also involved relocation, but a bit of a twist.
Yeah, a bit of a twist. It was heard at the Ontario Superior Court of Justice.
Okay.
In this case, the father initially agreed to let the mother move to Vancouver with their child.
Okay.
He even signed a travel consent form and bought the plane tickets.
Oh, wow. So really on board.
Really on board.
And then what happened?
And then after they moved, he completely changed his tune.
Oh, no.
Tried to block it.
Oh, wow. A real bait and switch.
Total bait and switch.
I bet that didn't go over well with the courts.
You would think.
But before we get into how the court handled that situation,
Sure.
um, was coercive control an issue in this case as well?
It was. The mother alleged that both the father and his parents had engaged in coercive control.
Okay.
She claimed they had control of her finances, that they treated her really poorly, that they constantly undermined her.
So it wasn't just the father. It was like a whole family dynamic.
A whole family dynamic.
But he did agree to it initially. So how did the court reconcile those two things?
Well, remember how we talked about evidence being so important in these cases?
Yeah.
So that signed consent form and the plane tickets were key pieces of evidence.
Right.
Because it showed he had initially agreed. But then the court looked at his actions after the relocation, and it became clear that he had stopped communicating with the mother, and he wasn't paying child support.
And all this after he had agreed to her moving?
Exactly.
And she was living in a shelter?
And they were living in a shelter.
Oh my goodness. So the court was probably thinking, this guy's not really putting his kid first.
They weren't impressed at all.
Yeah.
They basically said that his actions didn't match up with his words.
Okay.
You know, even if he truly believed that this move wasn't in the best interest of the child, his behavior afterwards showed that he wasn't putting the child first.
That makes sense. So the big takeaway from this case is you can't just talk the talk.
Actions speak louder than words.
You got to walk the walk,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to your kids.
Yep,
The courts are watching.
they are.
They're paying attention. So we've seen how coercive control can play out in these relocation disputes, both when it's a central issue right from the start
Yeah.
and when it kind of emerges after there's already been this agreement that's made.
Yep.
So let's move on to our last case today,
Okay.
SCVNC, which takes us to the Saskatchewan Court of King's Bench.
This is a good one.
This one sounds messy.
It is.
So this case involves a couple with 3 children and a history of shared parenting. That's right. The mother, SC, is alleging psychological and financial abuse by the father, NC, and she wants to change the custody arrangement.
Right. So we're shifting gears a little bit.
Yeah, so now we're talking about custody battles and allegations of abuse within the relationship.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is that they already had this shared parenting arrangement.
That's right.
So the court's basically being asked to reevaluate that.
Based on these new allegations.
Yeah, based on these new allegations. So this case really kind of digs into that whole question of how do you balance protecting children from harm
Yeah.
while also making sure that both parents' rights are being respected.
It's a tough balance.
It's a really tough balance.
Yeah.
And what's even more challenging is that in this case, the father isn't just denying the abuse. He's saying that her perception of events is skewed because of mental health issues.
Right.
So that brings up a whole other set of challenges.
Right, because how do you prove psychological abuse? It doesn't leave any physical marks. And then how do you assess the credibility of allegations when mental health is part of the picture?
It's a minefield.
It really is.
So how do they handle this in this particular case?
So to get a clearer picture, the court ordered a parenting assessment.
Okay.
So for our listeners who might not know what that is, it's where an independent expert,
Like a psychologist or something?
often a psychologist or a social worker,
Yeah.
comes in, evaluates the whole family dynamic,
Okay.
and makes recommendations to the court about what's best for the children.
So they're kind of a neutral third party
Exactly.
who can offer this really objective perspective.
Exactly.
So what did the parenting assessment find in this case?
So this is where it gets kind of interesting.
Okay.
The assessment actually found that the children were well-adjusted.
Really?
Yeah. And they had strong relationships with both parents.
Oh, wow. That's not what I was expecting.
I know, right?
So even though there was this conflict between the parents, they were doing okay?
They were doing a pretty good job of shielding the kids from the worst of it.
That's amazing.
Right.
So even though she had alleged abuse, the expert didn't find any red flags in terms of like the children's well-being?
Not really.
Hmm.
But it's important to remember that this doesn't mean that the abuse didn't happen.
Right.
Okay, children are incredibly resilient,
Right.
and sometimes they can develop coping mechanisms that mask the negative impact.
Right. So they're not always going to show that they're struggling.
Exactly.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So how did the court rule given this kind of conflicting information?
Right. So they did acknowledge that there was evidence of psychological abuse in this relationship.
Okay.
However, they didn't find enough evidence to conclude that his behavior met the legal definition of coercive control.
Okay.
So it's important to keep in mind that these legal definitions can be quite specific.
Yeah.
And sometimes real-life experiences don't fit neatly into those boxes.
That's true.
Yeah.
So they're basically saying, yes, there was abuse, but it didn't rise to the level where we would completely change the custody arrangement.
Right.
So even though they believed her, they still decided to prioritize the stability for the children.
Exactly. Because they seem to be doing well under the current arrangement.
It sounds like they were really kind of walking this tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to protect the children,
Mm-hmm.
while also recognizing that cutting off a parent's access should be a last resort.
Right. It should only be done when absolutely necessary.
Yeah, it's not something you want to do.
No, not at all. And this case really highlights how courts are grappling with these really difficult situations where there's no easy answer.
Right.
Because you have to consider the safety and well-being of the kids. You
Right.
have to consider the rights of both parents
Right.
and the long-term impact of your decisions.
There's no magic formula. That's a
Yeah.
case-by-case thing.
Exactly.
But it sounds like they are taking allegations of abuse more and more seriously.
Absolutely. Which is a really positive step.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. So this case had another layer to it as well,
It did.
this whole financial layer.
Yes.
So on top of everything else we've just talked about,
Yeah.
we've got this big debt that was owed to the mother's parents.
Right.
We've got disputes about pension valuations and even a consumer proposal filed by the mother.
Right. We have to unpack all of that.
Yeah, so before we get into all of that, maybe just a quick explanation of what a consumer proposal is.
Sure. So basically, it's a legal agreement where someone who is struggling with debt proposes a plan to their creditors
Okay.
to repay a portion of what they owe.
So it's like an alternative to bankruptcy.
It is. It can really help people get back on their feet financially.
So in this case, the consumer proposal was a sign that she was really struggling financially.
Exactly.
Okay, so this case really is like a crash course in all the different things that come into play when a couple gets divorced.
It is. You've got allegations of abuse, you've got custody battles, you've got these complex financial issues.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And that's the reality of family law. You know, it's messy,
Yeah.
it's emotionally charged,
Yeah.
and they're rarely easy answers.
No.
But I think by understanding the legal principles at play and having access to accurate information, you can navigate these challenges more effectively.
That's a great point. We've covered so much in just this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
Listener, I hope you're still with us.
I hope so.
We've explored these three very different cases that illustrate all these different aspects of how coercive control is impacting Canadian family law.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen how that definition of best interests of the child is evolving.
It is.
And we've talked about the challenges of proving abuse, the
Mhm.
importance of evidence.
Absolutely.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we have.
So the next part of our deep dive, we'll dig deeper into the specifics of these cases
Yeah.
and really explore the implications of these rulings for the future of family law in Canada.
Absolutely. Stay tuned. Welcome back.
All right, so let's unpack these cases a little bit more, starting with Shipton v. Shipton,
Oh, okay.
the one where the appeal court really sent a message about coercive control.
They really did. This case wasn't just about disagreeing over a move to Ireland. It was about exposing this pattern of behavior that had been going on for years.
Mm.
Remember all those specific examples of the father controlling her finances, isolating her from her support network,
Yeah.
even physically restraining her at times?
Yeah, it's scary to think that that could be happening, and the trial judge didn't even think it was relevant to the case.
I know, and that's why this appeal court decision was so significant. They were basically saying, wake up, trial courts. Coercive control is a serious issue, and you absolutely have to consider it when you're deciding what's best for a child. They even pointed out that the trial judge had dismissed some really important evidence, like the testimony from the midwives,
Right.
who had actually observed the couple
Yeah.
interacting with each other.
So they were like independent witnesses.
Totally independent.
Wow.
And, you know, they were saying this kind of behavior can't just be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. And their reasoning went even deeper than that, right?
That's it.
They talked about how our understanding of childhood has evolved
Mm-hmm.
and how damaging it can be for a young child to be uprooted from their environment.
Especially when they've been exposed to coercive control.
Exactly. So it's not just about physical safety anymore.
Right.
It's about recognizing that emotional and psychological well-being.
And they even quoted this really powerful passage from a previous case about this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, emphasizing that young children aren't just these, adaptable beings who can bounce back from anything.
Right.
And they said that, this idea of treating a young child like a piece of putty that can be molded into any shape is completely offensive to the modern understanding understanding of childhood.
Wow, that's a really powerful statement.
It is.
It really drives home the point that the courts are taking the well-being of children much more seriously.
Much more seriously than they used to.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit now
Okay.
and talk about AJVMN,
Oh.
where the father initially seemed fine with the move to Vancouver
Yeah,
and then completely changed his mind.
totally.
The case of the signed consent form
Oh, yeah.
and the suddenly unsupportive dad.
Yeah, it seemed like a real he said, she said situation, but then the evidence really came into play.
Yeah, it did. And that's why it's so important to document everything
It really is.
in these kinds of disputes.
Absolutely.
She had that signed consent form.
It was huge for her
Yeah.
because it showed that he had actually agreed.
Right. But then his actions after the move really contradicted that.
Yeah, totally. He basically went radio silent, stopped communicating with her,
And stopped paying child support.
and stopped paying child support, even though they were struggling financially and living in a shelter.
Oh my gosh. It's almost like he was trying to punish her for moving even though he'd said it was okay.
It seems that way.
And the courts saw right through that, didn't
They
they?
did. They called him out for not putting his child's best interests first,
Yeah.
despite his claims that he was.
Yeah. Actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to that last case now.
Okay.
SCVNC.
All right.
The one with the psychological abuse and the shared parenting.
This one's a tough one.
It is. And remember, on top of that whole situation,
Right.
there was this whole financial mess to sort out as well.
A lot going on.
Yeah, but let's focus on the abuse allegations first.
Okay.
It's so hard to prove psychological abuse.
It really is. Because, it doesn't leave any physical marks.
Yeah.
So how did the court actually go about assessing those claims in this case?
Well, they ordered a parenting assessment.
They did.
Right.
Which, is a pretty standard procedure in these cases.
Right. And just to remind our listeners,
Yeah.
that's where an independent expert comes in,
Right.
observes the family dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
and gives the court an unbiased assessment of what's going on and what's best for the kids.
Exactly.
And what did they find in this case?
So this is where it gets kind of interesting. The assessment found that despite all the parental conflict and the allegations of abuse, the children were actually thriving under the shared parenting arrangement.
Wow. Okay, that's not what I was expecting.
I know it's a little bit surprising, but it just goes to show how resilient kids can be.
Yeah.
But we also have to remember that a positive assessment doesn't mean that the abuse didn't happen.
Right, because psychological wounds aren't always visible.
Exactly.
And kids are really good at hiding their struggles.
Sometimes they don't even know how to articulate what they're going through,
Right.
especially when they're young.
Yeah. So how did the court balance those two things?
Well, they did acknowledge that there was evidence of psychological abuse
Right.
in the relationship. However, they said they didn't have enough evidence to conclude that the father's behavior met that legal definition of coercive control.
Okay.
And, we have to remember that those legal definitions are very specific.
Right.
And sometimes real-life experiences just don't fit neatly into those boxes.
That's true. So they're basically saying, yes, there was abuse.
But it didn't meet the threshold for them to change the custody arrangement. Right. So they prioritized keeping things stable for the kids.
Yeah, because they seem to be doing well.
Right.
And that decision really reflects a key principle in family law, which is that courts are very reluctant to disrupt the status quo for children,
Right.
unless there's a really clear and compelling reason to do so.
So in this case, the kids being okay outweighed the concerns about the abuse.
Yeah, and I think it shows how the courts are trying to walk this tightrope
Yeah.
between protecting children
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that cutting off a parent's access should really be a last resort.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered the abuse allegations and the custody stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into that financial quagmire that was also part of this case.
Okay.
So we've got that big debt owed to her parents,
Mm.
disputes over pension valuations,
Yeah.
and a consumer proposal.
Where do we even begin?
I know, right? It's a lot. Let's start with that debt to her parents.
Because that's where things can get really complicated.
Yeah, because it's not like a bank loan where you have all the paperwork.
Right.
There often isn't a formal agreement outlining how it's going to be repaid.
So the court has to figure out who owes what.
Right, which can be a real nightmare.
Yeah. And then on top of that, you've got that whole pension issue.
Oh, the pensions.
Are so hard to value.
They're notoriously difficult.
Especially when someone's years away from retirement.
Yeah. How do you predict the future?
Right. So what was the problem in this case?
So the father argued that the standard way of valuing the pension,
Mm-hmm.
which basically projects its future worth,
Right.
was undervaluing it
Because she was so young still?
because she was so far away from retirement.
Yeah.
He wanted the court to take into account the potential for it to grow significantly over time.
So he was basically saying, give me more money now because her pension might be worth a lot more later.
Pretty much, but the court wasn't buying it.
Yeah, I can see why.
They pointed out that pension valuations are always based on assumptions
About the future.
about future earnings, interest rates, all sorts of things you can't predict.
Yeah, you can't predict the market.
And they said it would be unfair to penalize her by making her compensate for a potential future gain that may never actually happen.
Right. So they stuck with the standard method,
It did.
even though he was arguing for this more speculative approach.
And it really highlights an important point about family law, which is that fairness doesn't always mean an equal division of assets.
Right.
You have to look at all the circumstances, including the economic disparities that might result from a marriage breakdown, and try to reach a just outcome.
Which might mean one person gets more than the other.
It might.
It's not always about splitting everything right down the middle.
No, it's not.
Sometimes it's about making sure one person has enough to get back on their feet.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the debt,
Yeah.
the pension,
Mm-hmm.
and that consumer proposal, which indicated she was really struggling financially.
Yeah.
What's a big takeaway from all of that?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that the financial stuff can be just as complicated and contentious as the custody issues.
Absolutely.
And the court really has to weigh all the factors.
Yeah.
You know, debt assets, pensions, earning potential, even things like consumer proposals to try to come up with a fair and equitable solution.
It sounds like a giant puzzle
It is.
where the pieces don't always fit together neatly.
It's a real challenge.
And just like with the custody stuff, having the right information and getting expert advice
Yeah.
can make all the difference.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we've certainly dissected these cases from every angle.
We have.
We've looked at the legal side of things, the emotional complexities,
Mm-hmm.
the financial stuff.
All the messy bits.
Listener, I hope you're still with us,
I hope so too.
but we've only scratched the surface.
We have.
So in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to zoom out a bit
Okay.
and look at the bigger picture.
Mm.
Yeah, what do these cases tell us about the future of family law in Canada?
That's the big question.
It is. And that's what we'll be talking about in part 3 of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've spent the last 2 parts really dissecting those 3 cases.
We really have gone deep.
And now it's time to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
Look at the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
What trends are we seeing here? What can these cases tell us about the future of family law in Canada?
Right, so big picture thinking time.
Exactly. So what's jumping out at you as you think about all of this?
Well, one of the biggest things for me is this growing recognition of coercive control
Yeah.
and how it's impacting all aspects of family law. You know, Shipton v. Shipton really set the stage for that.
It did.
The appeal court didn't just, mention it briefly.
Yeah.
They made it crystal clear that this has to be considered in these cases.
They're basically saying we can't sweep this under the rug anymore.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about acknowledging the problem. They actually overturned the trial judge's decision because he don't give enough weight to the evidence.
To the evidence of coercive control.
Right. They're sending a message to those lower courts. You need to take these allegations seriously, and you need to understand how coercive control can affect a child even if there's no physical abuse.
So it's about protecting the victim, but it's also about protecting the children
Absolutely.
and how it impacts their best interests.
Exactly.
And we're really seeing that idea of best interests evolving,
They are.
right? It's not just about basic needs anymore.
It's much broader than that.
It's about emotional well-being.
Mm.
It's about making sure kids are growing up in a healthy and stable environment.
Absolutely. Free from that kind of damaging control.
And I think we've seen that in all 3 of the cases we've discussed.
I agree.
Not just Shipton.
Another trend I've noticed is just how important evidence is becoming.
Yeah.
Especially when you have these situations where there are 2 different versions of what happened.
Right. He said, she said.
Yeah. And remember AJVMN, where the father initially agreed to the move but then changed his mind?
Yeah, that signed consent form was so important for her.
It was crucial. If she didn't have that, who knows what would happen?
Yeah. It really highlights why you need to document everything.
Absolutely. Even if you think everything's amicable,
Right.
you never know when things might go sideways.
And it's not just about paper trails, right? It's about getting evidence from different sources.
Right, like those midwives in Shipton.
Yeah, you have to build a case.
Even if you don't think you're going to court.
Yeah. Be prepared.
Absolutely.
Okay, speaking of messy situations,
Okay.
Let's talk about the financial side of SCVNC.
Oh, yeah, that was a whole other layer.
So much going on there.
Uh,
The debt, the pension, the consumer proposal.
It was a lot. It highlights how complicated things can get when you're trying to divide assets.
Yeah, pensions are a nightmare.
They really are, especially when you're trying to figure out what they're worth years down the road.
Right, and then you throw in family loans.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is.
Yeah.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners when it comes to the financial side of divorce?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to be proactive. Have those conversations up front.
While you're still together.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
You know, talk about finances openly.
Yeah.
And if possible, get things in writing.
Especially when it comes to family loans.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can save so much trouble down the road.
It's like preventative medicine for your divorce.
Exact.
And if you are facing a complex financial situation in your divorce, get help.
Absolutely.
Talk to a financial advisor, an accountant, a lawyer.
They can help you figure out your options.
Right, because knowledge is power.
It is.
Okay, any other big picture thoughts before we wrap up?
Just one more thing. I think it's really important to remember that family law is always changing.
Right.
What we talked about today might not be the same 5 or 10 years from now.
It's evolving.
It is. So it's important to stay informed.
Yeah, keep up with the changes.
Exactly. And I'd like to leave our listeners with this thought. Think about these trends we've talked about today and how they might connect to your own life or the lives of people you know. How do these changing norms around coercive control the definition of best interests, the importance of documentation? How do those things resonate with you?
It's about taking what we've learned and applying it to the real world.
Exactly.
Because family law isn't just an abstract concept. It's about real people, real families, and it affects all of us in some way.
It really does.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Canadian family law.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope you've learned a lot and that you'll join us again next time.
See you then at this